Okay, let's go ahead and jump right in. This is one of the largest videos that I've created, and I had a lot of fun putting as much information into this one as I could, so I hope you enjoy it. Now, you can already see that I have my pencil sketch down on my paper, and I'm going to be using a fountain pen for this sketch. I'm going to start with a few long lines. So the trick to getting these lines somewhat straight is to really have a good hand position. And you can see as I draw my lines, I'm going to constantly be rotating my hand, and that's going to give me the ability to draw a straighter line. The other thing that you might notice is that I'm going very slow and I'm taking my time as I draw that line. That way, if I notice that my line's not staying straight, I'm able to make an adjustment if needed. Another trick that you'll see me do is that I won't always draw the line in one go. I'll actually draw it in sections, and that start-stop motion can help me to keep that line straight. Okay, I want to talk about something else that you probably noticed in this video, and that's the black book next to my sketchbook. That black book is actually another sketchbook that's the same height as the one I'm drawing in. And the reason for that is that it's going to help give me a place to rest my hand. If I did not have this sketchbook here, I'd be resting my hand at a different plane than my sketch, and it would just create for some awkward hand positions. You'll notice that as I move the hand positions, I'll move that book as well. Okay, as I draw this lantern here, you'll see it's just a series of straight lines, and depending on the line, whether it's a vertical line or a horizontal line, I'm going to move that black book to support my hand position, because you'll see that on the vertical lines, I'll approach my line from the side, and from the horizontal lines, I'll approach it from the bottom. And what I'm not doing is I'm not connecting my lines. So this shape is a bunch of squares. And at no point am I going to be trying to connect a vertical line and a horizontal line with the same line. I'm going to constantly reposition my hand so that each line is drawn separately and straight. In a minute here, you'll see how I draw a segmented line. That's where I'm picking my pen up and then placing it back down to continue that line. And I'll do that a couple of times just to help make sure that I can make a straight line. And I do this particularly on the really long lines. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the pen that I'm using to draw with. This is the Pilot fountain pen, the Kakuno fountain pen, and I'm using black ink. I'm actually using Pilot's own black ink. I really like how this draws. The ink flows really well from the tip. I do have to be careful that I am drawing with the tip flush to the paper. I do have a tendency to rotate the tip and draw on the side. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But it's a very clean pen to draw with. And I'm using the fountain pen with the fine tip, and it's about the right size for the sketches that I like to do. Now, I am able to get a slightly thicker line by pressing the pen a little firmer on my page. I like to go back and forth through different drawing utensils. I have a couple of different pens and pencils that I like to draw with. So I enjoy switching it up and trying different utensils for a while, and after I get bored with one, I'll switch back and I'll use another one for a while. Alright, as I continue to draw the storefront here with the doors and the windows, you'll notice that I'm continuing that same technique of making sure that my hand placement is in the correct spot for the line that I'm drawing. So I'm constantly rotating my hand to either approach it from the side or from the bottom. And right now I'm going to start adding hatch lines to my windows. This is a little interesting because I didn't like the way it turned out, and I had just gotten off of a series of thumbnail sketches that I've been using with my fountain pen to draw several building studies. I really enjoyed practicing those sketches, but I think I was in the habit of continuing to do those hatch lines. I attempted to add some value to this scene by adding those hatch lines to the windows, and I really didn't like how it turned out. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this plant that I'm going to draw. I've talked in previous videos about my technique to approach plants. However, this particular plant, I'm using a slightly different technique, and the reason being is that I wanted to make sure that my sketch captured the essence of the plant. So in the past, I've talked about my triangle technique. I am using a similar version of that here, but I'm exaggerating the sharpness of the strokes to try to capture the shape of those leaves on this plant. Drawing plants can be tricky because a common mistake is to rush through it, and oftentimes you'll overlook those small details that really add to the essence of a plant. So, with this plant in particular, I was trying to be very careful to capture what I thought were major focal points within the plant. So, branches that stuck out, or more dense spots, or natural breaks that the plant creates with its leaves. I also want to point out that the reason that I stopped drawing out the storefront windows and switched over to the plant is because that my plant was in the foreground, and I wanted to block out that shape first to allow me to draw in the rest of the storefront windows around the plant. So as I start to finish these windows up, you're going to notice that I'm going to go back and use that hatch line technique to add that value to those dark windows. Now, again, I don't like the way it turned out, but I'm thinking that I can fix this when I move over to shading. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I do that. Okay, now I want to take a minute and talk about my grip. You'll notice that I'm using different grips throughout this sketch. Depending on what line I am drawing or what detail I am drawing, I'm going to adjust my grip up or back. And when I'm drawing long, straight lines, I'm going to probably have my grip more toward the back of the pen. And that's just going to give me more flexibility to draw a longer, straighter line. This also promotes a looser grip. Now you'll see me move my grip up on the pen when I'm adding detail, when I need to control that tip a little better. One thing I also want to point out about my grip, and for whatever reason, I have a really bad habit of constantly adjusting my grip, and that translates to me rotating my pen slightly. So if you pay attention or if you look closely, you might notice that I'm drawing a couple of lines without actually putting any ink on my paper. And that's because I've accidentally rotated my fountain pen to the point where it's on the side and I can't draw with it. Okay, as I finish up the details in the hallway here, you'll notice that I didn't spend a lot of time adding a lot of detail. And that's because this isn't really my focal point. My focal point is more to the left side of this storefront. In fact, the farther away from my focal point that I get, the less detail I'm going to add. Especially when I get outside of this entryway, you're going to notice that a lot of the detail is more just suggested lines. As I start to draw in some of the tile work in the building, I want to point out that part of this scene was selected specifically because of this tile work. I really liked how it provided more depth to the scene, and it gave me a lot more texture to work with. And speaking of texture, the other component of why I chose this scene is all of the texture. There is a lot of bricks, wood, plants, a combination of manufactured and organic textures, and I really liked the way it looked, and I think that was going to play really nicely in a sketch. I also enjoy practicing all these different textures. It's a lot of fun for me. And the last component of why I chose this scene is all of the values that it had. The scene featured a lot of good contrast, not only through texture, but through light and color. And I really think scenes that have a lot of good contrast, natural contrast, tend to do better as a sketch. And especially for someone like me who's been trying to work on capturing more contrast and depth in their sketch, I think this was a good opportunity to practice that. I want to talk about an interesting note about this sketch. This sketch actually technically took me maybe a month to do. And I know that sounds like a long time, but what happened was when I started this sketch, I actually ran into a small issue that caused me to stop. And I can't recall what it was, but I remember not being able to finish it. And that was partly on me for not allowing myself enough time to complete a sketch. But I ended up letting the sketch sit for a while before I can get around to it. And in the meantime, I ended up acquiring a set of Copic markers. So I was really only expecting to add shades of gray to the sketch, like I normally do. But I decided that this would be a great opportunity to test my coloring skills since I had that new set of markers. It's interesting because you'll start to see some of the challenges that I run into and then how I navigate them. And I'll talk about that as that comes up. As you can see, I'm starting to draw the rest of the plants in the front here, and I am using some very broad oval shapes to capture the essence of those broad leaf plants. And once I'm done with that, I'm going to add some small detail on the edge here, and I'm going to move over and finish up the plants here. Since this area of the plants wasn't affecting any of my line work on the building front, I didn't need to address it until now. And as I wrap it up, you'll notice that I'm trying to add different areas of value, areas where I can show or imply depth and shadows. And this, I think, helps visually break up those plants into their own organic shapes. Now, I mentioned previously that as I get farther away from my focal point, I tend to add less detail, and that's exactly what's happening here. I'm just going to quickly add a little bit of detail to the edges of my scene. Once I finish up drawing these sign lamps, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this sketch up by adding texture. I'll start by adding the wood in the sign here, and then I'll move over to the brickwork. And for the bricks, notice that I am not completing any of these lines. And the reason I'm doing that, I mentioned previously, is that it helps me keep those lines straight. So by breaking up the lines, what I can do is that I can actually make an adjustment on the fly and keep that line parallel to the one below it. I'm constantly looking at the other lines and angles in my scene when I'm drawing a bunch of parallel lines like this. I admit it, I can still easily draw lines off parallel. I do take a little bit of extra care when I'm trying to draw these lines. And now I'm just going to go ahead and add the individual bricks, making sure to stagger the lines as I work my way up the building. I don't need to draw every single brick, but I am going to draw enough of them because I do want the brick texture to be part of the focus. And now I'm going to switch over to shading. I will start with my typical shading technique. I'm going to find the midtones in my scene, and I'll use a light gray to add those, and then I'll work my way to the darker grays. Now, I do want to point out at this point I lost my primary camera, and unfortunately I only have the backup cameras and lost all of my shading technique. But you can see from here how I work my way through the light grays to the dark grays, and eventually I'll grab the black marker to add my deep shadows. And with my scene shaded, I'm ready to move over to my colors. Now, as you may have noticed, I have a set of 36 Copic markers, and despite that, I am still very limited in my color selection. I actually had to get creative on some of the colors, and you'll see an example of that soon. But first, I'm going to start similar to how I normally tackle shading, and that is I'm going to pick a midtone value for my bricks, and I'm going to cover the entire area with that value. Now, I will make heavy use of the alcohol marker's ability to layer in color. That is, I can get deeper shades of one color simply by going over it multiple times. I'll do this for the brickwork, and I'll add individual bricks, and you'll notice that I'll do this again on the wood sign and even on the storefront bricks. This technique can go a long way to add a little extra texture to your scene. Okay, in a moment, I'll start to add green to my plants. And what you're going to see me do is you're going to see me pause. I'm going to hesitate because when I put that green down, I noticed that it was much more saturated than I was expecting. I was looking for another shade, but unfortunately this was the closest one that I had. And that's when I made the decision that I could probably mute the color with my warm gray colors. And so I decided to push forward. And because I had that thought, I actually got a little more brave with the other shades of green, knowing that they might be too vibrant, but I was always going to be able to pull them back with the layering technique I had in mind. Okay, so now you can see that I am using a warm gray, and I'm just going to coat all of the colors to help mute those to pull that saturation back. And I'm actually going to work my way up to a darker gray, and I'm just going to hit some of those shadows to provide more depth. I do want to point out there are a few types of grays, and in my set, I have cool grays and warm grays. The cool gray markers tend to be more on the blue side, and the warm gray markers are my gray tones that tend to be on the red side, or they come off a little more beige or brown. And now I'm going to start to wrap up all of my colors. And the one thing that I noticed as I've added my colors is that all of these colors are actually starting to make my scene feel a little more flat. So I'm going to take another pass at my shading. For those who are counting, I added a shading layer first, then a color layer, and now I'm going to add a second layer of shading on top. But this time I'm going to use my favorite digital coloring technique, and that is to use a dark blue marker to add all my shadows. I think this really adds a lot more interest to my shadows and to the scene, and as you can see, it creates a lot more contrast with the rest of those colors. And here's the final image. I'm actually really happy with these results. This one was a really fun one for me. And if you're enjoying these videos, please give it a like and subscribe.